short person. So I am the lucky person to moderate this panel. We do have Tom Coverick from Keybanc. We have Garrett Brinker from Neighborly, and this is not Polly. Sadly, Polly had a transportation issue and contacted me late yesterday, and she could not make it today. And so we've asked Chris to jump in because Chris has an encyclopedic memory of all kinds of information about broadband infrastructure projects and how they are funded. So we will rely on that knowledge to provide us with that level of support. So I'm going to ask you each to tell us just 3 minutes of a little bit of who you are and how you know about this and what your company does. And in Chris's case, a little about ILSR and what you do. And we'll start with you, Chris.
I was going to pass. So the Institute for Local Self-Reliance is a 44-year-old nonprofit organization that is focused on keeping communities strong, which every organization sees themselves as doing something like that. The way we think about it is that we want to have political and economic power locally. Our argument is that one cannot have political power locally without economic power. We want communities to be self-reliant. And we very much distinguish that from self-sufficient. The goal being that communities make the most of the resources they have. They take responsibility for everyone in their communities, and they have the capacity to decide their own future. About 12 years ago, we started doing broadband-focused work, recognizing that everyone needed internet access. Every community needed internet access. I sometimes think of it like I go camping for a week or two and I don't need electricity, but if my community doesn't have electricity, my community is really going to suffer. And I think we're seeing that with internet now. It's obvious to everyone, but that's what brought us to start thinking about it that way. And we've really focused on the ways communities can ensure that they have their own internet access. Our preferred way is when they own it themselves in some sort of municipal arrangement or cooperative arrangement, because it makes it more difficult to privatize. But we are very interested in any mechanism that has a long-term lasting solution that will be difficult for a few people to sort of take over for their own private gain. And I guess the final point on that is that we're very interested in the finances behind it. Because this is crucial to the long-term success of a project. We don't want to see communities building networks that are not sustainable. We want to see communities building networks that meet their goals. And that generally is some kind of financial sustainability. So we try to track this pretty closely. And the final point is that one of the reasons we like working at the community level is local governments have a capacity to borrow. And that's something that distinguishes them from other local entities that might have an interest but not the capacity to invest in these kinds of infrastructures.
Thanks.
Garrett Brinker, and I'm with Neighborly. And most simply, we connect communities and capital. So what we do is we help finance world-positive public infrastructure projects. That's ranged from your classics, like your schools and your bridges and your roads and your playgrounds and your bike lanes, to really now focusing on more resilient, future-proof public infrastructure projects like solar microgrids and especially municipal broadband networks. And what we really see is municipal broadband networks, community broadband networks being the 21st century bridge. I live in San Francisco. I live in a neighborhood. I'm lucky to live in a neighborhood that looks out over the Golden Gate Bridge, and I'm reminded in the early 1930s when the city decided to come together to invest in that project locally, to build that project locally, to build that iconic public infrastructure project that still exists today. What that required was local investment, and what that did was unlock untold amounts of job creation, of economic development, of opportunity that lives on in that part of the country today. And what we really see, as broadband, community broadband being the 21st century bridge in this information-based economy is absolutely vital to have access to information, have access to connectivity. And so we really see connectivity as a fundamental right. And so, what we're really focused on now is using these public financing mechanisms to really help unlock capital across the country in urban areas and suburban areas and rural areas to build that 21st century bridge that we believe all future and resilient type public infrastructure projects that will come in the future will be built on top of.
And it's nice to see everybody here. My name is Tom Coverick. I'm a managing director with Keybanc Capital Markets. And I will congratulate Deb and her team on putting together a very nice audience today, because I'll tell you that some of the panels I sit on, they tend to be either right after lunch like today or at the end of the day, and people are nodding off from lunch or waiting to go to cocktails. So I appreciate everybody's attention, and thank you for being here and supporting Deb and her initiatives. I'm glad to be on this panel because I think that over the course of the last 5 years, what we've seen is a shift in the audience that we talk to at these types of sessions. A few years ago, there would be no one in this room because nobody wanted to think about or even talk about financing these types of projects. And where we are today is people like yourselves trying to figure out, we know there's a need. Our constituents have a vested interest and have expressed an interest in providing these projects. Your politicians, your staffers, your economic development folks, everybody in your business community is wanting better service, but the head scratcher is, how does this get paid for? And so one of the things that we're going to endeavor to talk about today is, some of the examples that we've seen, and I can talk a little bit about what we've done at the bank. I've been with the bank for over 11 years. Key is one of the top 20 banks in the country. I think some of you who live locally at least know Key is a rather newcomer because we did acquire First Niagara recently, and so you'll probably see Key branches around, and so we're a little more familiar than we might have been a year or two ago. We're very active in the communities. We're very supportive in the communities where we have businesses. We are in 14 states across the country. We boast that we have one of the first female CEOs of a national bank, and her name is Beth Mooney. So the bank is committed not only to the communities that we serve, but it's committed to diversity as well. We have been involved in several transactions, and I'll highlight just a couple. We worked with Utopia in Utah, and we actually are one of their bondholders. Utopia has been a turnaround story. They've been in existence since 2004. And so they really were a pioneer in terms of municipal broadband, and we can talk a little bit more about that as we go through. And we've also been a long-term financial partner with Utopia and their sister agency, the Utah Infrastructure Agency, underwriting all of their bonds as well as holding their debt and structuring new credit for them. We work with Minet, which is a consortium of 2 communities in Oregon, Monmouth and Independence, Oregon. We restructured their entire capital structure a few years ago, and they are a very solid entity as well. So that's kind of my introduction. Deb, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions here, but I'd love it if you'd start thinking about what your questions might be, because I'll ask a couple and then I'll look for some questions from the audience, and then at the end I'll come back with an additional question to wrap it up. Okay? So I'm going to start by asking Garrett. So something new going on at Neighborly. You've undertaken this new effort to support local communities, and I believe you call it the Accelerator. Can you tell us what it's about and why it is important to Neighborly?
Yeah, so we launched the community broadband, the Neighborly Community Broadband Accelerator, I believe back in August, and we are now working on selecting those communities now, working with folks like Deb and Chris, who are part of the selection committee, and are planning to actually announce that cohort next week. But what the Accelerator is, we had this underlying belief that too often in the communities that we were talking with all across the country, that the concept of how this network is going to be financed was not coming up soon enough. And so they would go through this entire process, get towards the end, and then say, okay, now how are we going to finance it? And that's a problem. That's a problem. That what we believe is that actually. Back up the mic a little bit. Sure. So actually, from the first conversation that you're having in a community, whether that is a council member or a mayor or an advocacy group or one single person that says, I want to build a broadband network, that's when you should actually start engaging the finance director or the CFO and have those conversations with those folks. And so that was the underlying belief that we had to start the Accelerator. But then we took that and expanded upon it and said, you know what we really want to offer is this full stack approach. to building a network. And if anyone's familiar with sort of a normal accelerator like Y Combinator that comes out of San Francisco, the ways in which you really help accelerate the work for startups. And this Y Combinator model has been then has been thrown to communities across the country at this point. But we took that concept where let's bring in more resources, let's bring in more people, let's bring in the products to help these communities across the country, and we created the Broadband Accelerator. And so first off, it's the ability to tools to help map, multiply, and accelerate your work on the ground. So that's through demand aggregation mostly, the ability to help communities understand where the support is on the ground, and then really help map that demand as well. It's access to industry experts like Deb and Chris and Tom, and we try to bring them all together in one room and ensure that communities across the country are able to talk to the best people in this space. Because what we've seen, especially in rural communities, is that they don't know where to go. They don't know who to talk to. They don't have access to the best in the industry. And so what we've done is say we're going to build that entire cohort as a part of the accelerator, and ensure that you have access as a community to all of them. And then at the end of the day, it's the ability, if you make it through this, if you go through the full accelerator and you're able to actually build the proper momentum in your community, there's then the neighborly capital network that you can then flow capital, both institutional and potentially local capital through that broadband project.
Thanks, Garrett. And I wouldn't necessarily say there weren't any resources, because I'd consider Chris and I those resources in our organizations. But I agree that it's really helpful to have that sort of through line that provides people from the beginning to the end all of the opportunities. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask Tom a question. In terms of private capital, do you think that their view has changed over time regarding the funding of municipal broadband or a public-private partnership? We were just talking at lunch about this and whether or not there has been some shift in how it's being viewed by private capital. Can you give us your opinion on that?
So I'm a public finance banker, and what we work on is obviously municipal bonds. We have endeavored to include some of our investment banking friends, colleagues, competitors in this marketplace. And I would say the answer is no. The private capital is not as available as you would expect it to be for system risk, for purely project finance where the underlying revenue stream is purely the telecom revenues. What we are seeing is obviously there have been a few transactions that have been done with that, but the borrowing cost is probably 2% higher than you can get in the capital markets, so it makes the borrowing cost sometimes prohibitive when you've got a construction risk built in for the first few years of a deal. So what we're recommending, Deb, is obviously getting your working group together as soon as possible. And what I mean by that is include your finance professionals as fast as you possibly can, include your bond counsel, include everybody. Because the sooner that you can identify how you're going to pay for your project, that is as vital as the design and implementation of the project itself. How is it going to get paid for? We've been in circumstances where the greatest plan was put in place, and guess what? When you go before the city council and you ask them how they're going to pay for it, the project gets voted down. So a lot of hard work has gone into these projects, but not a lot of thought has gone into how they're going to get paid for. That means involving your stakeholders early. That means involving people like bankers like myself, involving your bond counsel, involving your local lawyers, and really putting together a plan that works. And every plan, I think, will be different because everybody operates in their own vacuum, right? So whether it's a mixture of debt and pay-as-you-go funding, whether you can find some grant money that's out there, I think pulling all that together takes time, and I think it's crucial to involve the financial people early on rather than later. And I think that your ability to inform your stakeholders, either through your own efforts or by engaging public relations firms or professionals of that nature makes a huge difference in being able to not only inform your constituency, but also the board, because at the end of the day, as I always say, an uninformed vote is a no vote when you go to your city councils for these types of things. So being able to educate everybody early on in the process, I think, is very important. So a very long answer to your question, but I think the more financial wherewithal the cities and the counties and the municipalities have in a project, the easier it will be to sell it, and the easier it will be to sell it not only to your constituents and your stakeholders, but to the capital markets and to the investors as well.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to Chris now, and I'm going to ask you specifically, so working with as many communities as you do, you know a lot about how they're funding these. And so I want to ask you first about how Ammon, Idaho used local improvement districts. What is that process, and what did it look like, and how did it work for them?
So this is a very exciting development, I think, for solving a specific challenge for communities that either don't have the political interest in taking on risk, or maybe unable to take on the risk of financing a project using bonds. In Ammon, they had a network that they were building through major arterial areas because they had to connect their water stations. Water is very serious in the high desert. Their pumping stations. And then things like the community swimming pool, they got a quote from the incumbent, and the incumbent said, well, we have to drag a new copper line, and it's going to be this much one time, and then there'll be a recurring fee of this much. And they looked at that and said, well, if we just build our fiber there, it'll be cheaper, and the recurring costs will be almost nothing. So they had that kind of fiber in the streets for an institutional network. And they looked at expanding it, and they decided what they would do was they would open up to specific neighborhoods, and they picked target neighborhoods to start with. These are neighborhoods that had generally had cable internet service from a large company, but not one of the biggest ones you'd necessarily know right away, that was claiming to offer gigabit service. So this isn't a desert in the sense of the broadband desert. So looking at neighborhoods of approximately 350, 400 homes, how many people in these homes would want to finance their cost of a fiber build either by paying a one-time cost up front in the neighborhood of $2,500 to $3,000 for just the connection, one-time fee, or they could amortize that over 20 years with an assessment on their home, and that would come out to on the order of $1,650 a month for 20 years. And if they move, then there's a common real estate way of dealing with assessments and things like that. And they found that 75% of the people in those areas wanted that. Almost all of them went with the financing, I believe, or the amortization over 20 years. And so they did that, and that was sort of a cherry-picked neighborhood. They knew that it would be good. They went into another area that they thought would be a little bit more challenging, and they have like 80 or 90%, I think, take-up, maybe even higher. I don't want to oversell it. And then they had an area that's more low-income challenged, and they found that they still had 40 or 50% of people who are interested in getting that connection. So this is a way to transfer the risk to enthusiastic folks. And then the way the model works is you pay one time that might be spread over 20 years, but nonetheless it's a fixed length fee to have the infrastructure to your home. There's an ongoing maintenance fee, which in this case is on the order of $16 or $17, and that makes sure if things get cut or there's upgrades needed in core routers, things like that, then that takes care of those charges. So you have a recurring fee of at least $16, and then you can take different services from service providers on the network who you can subscribe to by just clicking a button on your web browser. You can go to this place and you can subscribe, and you can change your ISP, and it takes like 30 seconds to change everything around. Right now, I believe 100 megabits is going for $10, or is that a gig?
I think it's somewhere in that range.
Yeah, it's an incredible amount of access. And so, if you're amortizing at $1,650 and you're paying the maintenance fee around $16 or $17, and then the other fee, you're looking at about $45 a month, $50 a month, which is among the lowest cost nationally for this high quality internet service. And there's multiple providers who are competing. The goal ultimately is that then this would lead to a market for all kinds of services beyond just common internet service to telehealth functions. Their network is very cool. It's very next generation. We did a video about it, Next Century Cities and the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, about 20 minutes that explains it, talks about the public safety implications of it, the way they're doing it. That is called the virtual end of cable monopolies, I believe. But if you have any skill searching the internet, you'll be able to find it pretty easy. And then I think the last piece of it is that for people who are very enthusiastic about what Fletcher Kittredge was talking about earlier in terms of breaking the monopoly model, building an open access network and funding it solely with the revenues from the services has been very challenging. It's something that, as Tom noted, it nearly broke utopia, and they eventually have come back from real challenge. Most of the places that have done it successful have not financed the capital through the revenues of the network. There's a question back here from Art. So this model is a very interesting way of solving that problem of how you pay for the capital cost for an open access network. And it just also happens to have a lot of other benefits for people who take service, whether they're local businesses or residents.
Thank you. So I'm going to actually go back to you with one other question, and that is, so a more local town, Leverett, Mass., they did something really different too. You want to talk briefly about that before we
Well, this
move
is
on?
this is the sort of the fun. So for a lot of years, you had cities like Chattanooga, Wilson, Lafayette, even before like Minette. You have on the order of 40 communities that had built municipal fiber networks without using taxpayer dollars. They had engaged in fairly traditional borrowing using bonding, often from a municipal electric authority. And we were always having this fight because people were saying, you shouldn't compete with taxpayer dollars. None of those networks were built using taxpayer dollars. It was financed by private investors who were repaid by revenues. Leverett comes along and says, you know what we should do? We should use taxpayer dollars. That would make this a lot easier. And so they went to town meetings and they discussed it, and eventually they agreed to raise their property taxes to help fund a network. They didn't have, I think a few people in town had DSL service in Western Mass there, and they built a gigabit network that I think 70% of the community has now signed on to. They had a modest property tax increase that I don't recall offhand, but the Berkman Klein Center did a paper about it that I think covers those sorts of nitty-gritty details. The key part is that people are very happy, and even though property taxes went up, a lot of people who cared about internet access, their bills went down. And that's because they've been paying so much for satellite or for other wireless services. So they were paying for a more modest internet connection now that actually had far greater capacity, but the effect on their checkbook at the end of the day was that they were saving money.
Right, right. So we do have some questions. Do you want to use the microphone?
So the first question we have is for Chris. There is a method in funding renewables called the PACE model, which stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy, if I'm reading that correctly. Is this being used by anyone that you know of?
Well, it's very similar to the Emmon model. And it's, again, you tap into this whole body of law around assessments and things like that. One of the challenges PACE ran into is dealing with federal bureaucracies around FHA and things like that, or Fannie Mae, I forget exactly which ones, when it comes down to who is repaid first in the event of foreclosure and things like that. So there are a number of challenges around that. Different states have different rules around these sorts of things. But several states, including, I believe, Maine, have, and this is certainly somewhat related to what Carol was mentioning earlier with how Vermont changed their laws a little bit. In our experience, Colorado as well, states are willing to change their laws to enable this mechanism for investment, because especially if it's used with an open network, it's very politically popular.
Do you want to ask another one, Kat?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
The next question is for Garrett. Is Neighborly investing its own money? Is it a broker? Is it a consultancy? In other words, what money is being used?
In other words, what are you? So we're an underwriter. And so traditionally what we have done is we finance, we underwrite public projects, and then we go and find investors. And that could be institutions. but that's also focused on local investment as well, from places like in Madison, Wisconsin, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in Burlington, Vermont. What we have done is what is traditionally not possible at a larger bank is the ability for a bunch of bankers to go up and call a bunch of local people and ask if they want to invest in public infrastructure. Though there will usually be larger chunks that will just go directly where institutions will be investing in a bridge or a road or a broadband network. But the power of Neighborly is we're a technology platform. And so we're based in San Francisco, where most of our engineers and designers and product people are. And what we're really trying to do is build that platform that enables us to go out to any community in the country and enable that local investment, and to flow local dollars to create regenerative financing that ensures that a lot of that capital, instead of going to Wall Street, just going to Wall Street, is actually going back into the pockets of residents in that community. And so they can then go down the street into their main street and use those payments to go to the local movie theater or to go to the consignment shop. And we believe that that's a really, really powerful mechanism of bringing the market back to what it once was. This is the municipal bond market is a 200-year-old market that is, as we see it, the original impact investment. And in the past 70 years or so, we've sort of gotten away from that. So what we're doing is building this technology-first platform that really brings the market back to what it once was. But we have other abilities to flow different types of capital into projects, which we're starting to explore through direct loans and PE investments as well.
So I'm going to jump in with a question. What metrics are you looking at when you're trying to evaluate a community's ability to obtain credit? So we'll start with Tom.
So if you think about the municipal bond credit, the broader and more reliable a revenue stream, the better your rating and the better your rates in the capital markets. The more finite you become and the more definitive you are in a revenue stream behind the bonds, the more difficult it's going to be to access the capital markets, and obviously the more expensive it's going to be. So from our perspective, I think what we're looking at is not necessarily what kind of a credit there is, Deb, as much as what's available to a particular municipality. So as we sit down with a potential client, we'll ask them, what's the political wherewithal? What's the support of the politicians and the mayor and the city managers or the county officials who are going to ultimately approve this structure? And what's available? Are there special assessment districts? Are there LIDs available? Are there TIFs available? Are there sales taxes, as in the case of Utopia, which backed Utopia's debt? Are there franchise fees? Are there other taxes that are available, such as what was used with Utah Infrastructure Agency, what we refer to as UIA? So I think that when you start considering a specific credit, Deb, it's not necessarily the strength of the issuer itself, but more so what's available to the bondholder or to the investor or to the lender to pay back those bonds. So initially, I think that it will make a lot of sense for a municipality to provide some financial wherewithal, whether it's a sales tax back or a GO backing, if you're able to. I know locally you're not able to issue bonds based on these parameters, but in some instances you are. And so if you were to take a look at what's available, structure the deal around that, and you'll have access to the capital markets. And that doesn't mean that whatever you put in place today needs to necessarily be there. The deal can be structured in a way so you have spring performance covenants. So if perhaps after 5 years of operating revenues and certain coverage metrics, you're able to have certain covenants roll off, meaning if you have a debt service reserve requirement, or if the city has pledged a moral obligation, or if the county has a sales tax. Obviously, the more that's pledged to the bond deal, the less you have in other places. So if you're able to structure a deal in a way with spring covenants or with covenants that roll off due to performance metrics, there are ways to get it done. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to tell you that a AAA credit is when they lend its name to a broadband project isn't going to have name recognition in the marketplace as a strong credit. But what's underneath the bonds is ultimately going to dictate how you can access the capital markets and approach lenders.
Yeah, just to add to that, specifically for broadband networks, we're looking at a number of metrics, or a number of certain criteria. The network type, is it open access? Is it full retail service, dark fiber and conduit? The geography really matters. Is it going to be in urban, suburban, rural? That's obviously going to matter for density, for whether it's going to be pole attachments versus trenching, the length you're going to have to build in between households. And then, assets that are already in the ground as well is something that's big, including network scope, size of network, and then the phasing for the build out as well. And ultimately, I think as we see it, especially for broadband networks, investors need to be educated and comfortable with the investment that they're making, and so we try to really focus on investor education outreach there.
And Deb, if I could just go back to one other thing, I'll give you a live example because I think it's always helpful to have a live example, right? We have been a longstanding financial partner to UIA, the Utah Infrastructure Agency. About a year ago, we were brought in to restructure their existing debt portfolio and allow them to have a broader indenture in place. And the indenture is the document and the contract, if you will, with bondholders that dictates the terms of the bond offering, and everybody makes certain covenants and contractual promises within that indenture. The indenture that was in place a year ago is a lot different than the indenture that is in place today. And essentially what we did was we restructured the indenture. We paid off all the existing debt, and we were able to then put in place a much more friendly indenture, if you will, that allowed UIA to several different mechanisms to access the capital markets. The net effect of doing that basically diluted the coverage of the underlying franchise fee pledge. Not by much, but it diluted it. And we were able then to show coverage well over 2 times with the existing debt and the new debt that was issued. But because we had diluted that coverage on the franchise fees, the rating that we had existing on the bonds in 2017 before this was a AA3, and by the time we were done restructuring this, the rating agencies had knocked it down to a BBB-. So that in and of itself makes your eyebrows raised to the fact that the rating agencies and the investor community and the market participants are very skittish when it comes to these types of bond issues. And it's because of and I don't want to scare anybody. I just want to make sure that as you go into this, you realize there are things that need to be done. That's why you bring your financial professionals in earlier, your bond counsel. This was viewed as a telecom transaction, and because of that, the rating agencies and the investor community had a very difficult time taking on that risk without charging a premium to UIA. And it's a great credit. And I would argue it's well above a BBB.
I must have turned that off. So, Chris, we hear them talking a bit about the struggles in rural communities in particular. Can you tell us about a rural community? I'm thinking particularly RS Fiber. Can you talk about how they managed to bring their network into being?
Yeah, I think it's a project that is very close to my heart, in part because it leads me to say, gives me leeway to say that I think communities that can't figure out how to get good broadband, generally it's because of a lack of political will and organizing, not because of some financial constraint. They work for 5 or 6 years on different plans to try to figure out how to solve their problem. It's like 10 farming communities in a county and a half in south central Minnesota, about 700 square miles, and in which I think there's 8,000 households. And the largest town, I think, is 2,600. The smallest town is 700 or 800. Several of the towns didn't really have any kind of broadband. A lot of the farms had no access. And they did not have the capacity to just issue bonds. If in the event that the network would have struggled, they would have had to double their tax levies, which investors would have seen as not likely. So they instead decided that they would do a more complicated arrangement. Now, It's right after lunch. Let's talk about very complicated financing arrangements. We spell it out in a case study called Fertile Fields about how they really went about doing it. But fundamentally, they said we need to raise on the order of $70 million to serve every farm, every town with fiber. But we can raise $15 million and we can build a fiber ring that'll build towers that'll bring 25 megabit symmetrical, now 50 megabit symmetrical, point-to-point wireless to 90% of the farms, and we can build fiber in all of the population centers. That will cost in the order of $15 million. Still, we can't borrow that much money, but we can borrow $7.5 million and secure it with a promise that we will raise our property taxes in the event that the network does not generate enough revenues. Then, to attract other investors for the balance of the funds, we can subordinate our debt to theirs. So the network would have to come up so short of money before they would even the investors would lose a dime that they will be incented to participate in this project. And that led to them getting enough investors to get the project rolling, and now they're working on financing the rest of the fiber to the farms. All the towns have fiber, and the network is, frankly, it's doing quite well in the towns. Mediacom, the cable company, has basically started giving away their service at, in some cases, less than 50% of what they've been charging before to retain customers. So these small towns are seeing this influx of cash, which is quite nice for them. But it's very creative financing that I haven't seen elsewhere in terms of recognizing that you go to the people in the town and say, here's the situation. Best case scenario, we build this network, we have enough subscribers, it cash flows, your taxes don't change at all. Worst case scenario, your property taxes are going to go up on the order of like $30 a month on average, depending on your land holdings and this and that. Most likely case is in years 3 and 4, maybe your property taxes go up a little bit, and then they come back down as we get past those very difficult years on the early part of the network. And so that's what's been happening out there. They're in a very difficult situation right now, and we're going to see how things result as they come out of like year 3 and 4. But it has resulted in just incredible opportunities. And I think the Blandon Foundation estimated $120 million of value in the county for a network that costs a fraction of that, and they took a risk of a fraction of even that. So and it all happened just because they just kept working at it and being creative about how to finance it.
Yeah, when you were talking earlier about the importance of leadership, that really is a good example of how leaders really were positive. And I remember talking to the mayor of Gresham, who's involved in this, and he owns the auto parts store, right? He didn't know how this all worked. He knew the importance of having it, and he was a really
Gaylord.
strong ad.
Right.
Oh, Gaylord,
Yep.
sorry. Gaylord, you're absolutely right. And what's really cool is Gaylord now is going to be the home to a medical school, which never would have happened if they didn't have fiber. So there's a lot of that. So I'm going to turn back to Tom and Garrett about that question of leadership, because you alluded to it a little bit. But can you talk a little bit more about how that impacts your engagement with the community that's interested in building out broadband?
Yeah, it's obviously it's important to have the mayor, city council members on board for all of, especially legal reasons. But I think what we really advocate for are local champions, are leaders on the ground. There's Jake Brewer, who is a former advisor to President Obama, who was actually tragically killed in a cycling accident a few years ago, talked a lot about pothole politics, this concept of finding the folks, and this has been reiterated in other communities, but find the folks who really care about fixing the potholes. And then go to them and empower them to go talk to others in the community to talk about fixing those potholes. And eventually, you're going to build a movement in that community that enables you to fix all of those potholes. And so this concept of, we really advocate for this concept of a local champion or a local fiber champion. And Chris was talking earlier about Ammon, Idaho, and they really have embraced this. You can actually go up there. I remember going up there in the middle of January last year and seeing on a screen, they had mapped exactly where those local fiber champions are in that community. And because, that is the leadership that people are looking for. And so that concept of fixing the potholes is directly analogous to how you would build a broadband network. And because, we really advocate for bringing in community engagement into part of these financing conversations. But, I find myself to be a fairly trustworthy person, but they're going to trust it's going to be a lot better than me talking to the community, or it's going to be a lot better for the local fiber champions to talk to their neighbors and their neighbors' neighbors about building that broadband network than it is going to be for me to convince them to do so. And so what we really advocate for and what we try to do is empower those folks most effectively, because they're the ones that can actually provide the leadership on the ground to get the mayors and city council members on board. This has been actually really powerful. I've seen in Portland, Oregon, with municipal broadband PDX, and Chris and I were up there a few months ago to really have the kickoff of municipal broadband PDX, the advocacy group that has really been leading the efforts, and folks like Michael Hanna up there who have led the efforts in trying to get a network off the ground. And what they've done is assembled a group of hundreds of people at this point to lobby Multnomah County, the county in which Portland resides, and I believe 4 or 5 other jurisdictions. And they went from jurisdiction to jurisdiction to get the money together to help fund, I think, about a $300,000 feasibility study, and to get that off the ground. And that's the leadership. That the leadership came from the grassroots level. It came from folks like Michael Hanna. It came from Municipal Broadband PDX. And now they have, they've been able to get almost every single political leader in Multnomah County and Portland and the other jurisdictions that are a part of that county on board with this. And so I think we really advocate, it's fantastic when you have a mayor on board, when you have a city council member on board from the beginning, but you really need to drive a lot of these efforts from the bottom up, and that's where we see the most powerful leadership happening.
And I couldn't agree with Garrett anymore. The one thing that I would add, though, is that those champions need to be informants. They need to be the scribes and the town crier, if you will. And they, excuse me, they need to really understand that driving home certain messages to whoever their stakeholders are and the constituencies are a few things. Excuse me. One is that there is a cost to waiting. That cost is not only in terms of time and resources that go by, but there's also a risk that interest rates will rise. So when you do need to access the capital markets, or you do need to approach lenders, we are in a rising interest rate environment. That's a fact. So when you look at borrowing costs alone, that can add millions of dollars to a project, depending upon the scope and size. I would also say that making sure that these champions know that another part of the message is that this service, this initiative, while it's not yet an essential service, over time it's going to be. And I think there are a lot of people in this room that will argue that it already is, but it's convincing others of that. It's convincing local participants. It's quite frankly, it's informing, and that's one of the challenges that we've talked about, the folks on this panel separately and sidebars, is that we have to convince the rating agencies, and we have to convince investors and lenders that this is an essential service, and it's going to be just like water and sewer, and public power.
Thanks. We're going to go back to Kat for another question. It does.
So I'm going to combine two questions about the role of different federal programs. So could you guys talk a little bit about the role of E-rate and the role of the newly defined federal opportunity zones? And maybe we could start by giving a definition of those programs.
Well, I want to talk about the opportunity zones. So I don't want to talk about opportunity zones, so let me talk a little bit about E-rate. E-rate is a program nearly 20 years old now, I believe, from the federal government, administered through the Federal Communications Commission, that subsidizes access to schools and libraries based on the amount of poverty in a given region. And that has been a tool that has been used by many municipal networks to both basically get the biggest buck for the dollar that's spent of public money for subsidizing schools, as well as to help finance a larger build. So there's been a number of communities that have recognized they are overpaying for the access to their municipal buildings, the police station, the schools and libraries. And if they build their own network, they will save money sometimes as fast as a year, often in 10 years, most often really in between those two. And so they do that, and they can apply for E-rate funding, which is a competitive bid process. And if they win the bids for the schools, then the federal government will subsidize the connection to the schools, which would then lower the cost to the municipality of building that network out through the city streets and that sort of thing. So that's been a program. Now, I will just say briefly that this is a program that the current FCC views as a incumbent slush fund, I would say, and they view cities doing this as wasteful overbuilding and unnecessary, because incumbents can already deliver services, often at tremendously marked up rates to schools and libraries. So there's a political controversy around it, and the program is sort of changing a little bit. So you definitely want to get some strong advice from someone who works in the trenches on this issue if you're thinking about using that.
I do wish you'd speak your mind, Chris. So I'll jump in just a little bit, because our expert, Polly, was unable to be here today. And say, when I was a principal, so I have direct experience with E-rate, 90% free and reduced lunch in my school, so there was a 90% reimbursement rate. The city of Boston was an eligible telecommunications carrier, could provide the service to my school and receive that 90% reimbursement. So that's a wonderful way to help fund a network, manage a network, help pay for upkeep and so forth. So it's definitely a process that can be helpful. As you say, Chris, though, there are changes happening, and my one recommendation is that you find a good consultant that deals with this every day, because E-rate is complex, the rules change regularly, the deadlines are obscure and a little bit hard to keep track of if you've got a big city to run and other issues to deal with. I think you might want to consider doing that if that's something you're thinking about. Just to tell you, when we hired an E-rate consultant, we were able to immediately save $5 million in Boston. So thinking about how you do that would be helpful. So we have only 5 minutes left. So gentlemen, do you want to answer the other half of that question about opportunity zones?
Yeah, I'll just quickly touch on it. For those that don't know, opportunity zones were created in the 2017 tax bill as really a way in which you could flow private capital through low income and disadvantaged neighborhoods. And so it's a big promise of potentially $6 trillion, I believe about $6 trillion in capital gains tax incentives that are potentially at stake here. And to give you a sense of the scale of this, I believe the next biggest similar program is the Low Income Housing Tax Fund, which is only $9 billion. And so this is really focusing on an asset class of high net worth individuals that have traditionally been on the sidelines of community development, and trying to bring them into find ways through tax incentives, through capital gains tax incentives, to really flow a lot of private capital into low income and disadvantaged neighborhoods across the country. I believe 8,700 census tracts have been identified for this program. We're just starting to explore it. There's some really exciting work going on. We have a few really big conferences actually in California that are happening over the course of the next few weeks that are focusing specifically on this. And so we really see opportunity zones as for massive potential, specifically for broadband. I think what I would just advise is get local governments to start thinking like investors, and start thinking about how to use opportunity zones as that capital stack. And one maybe bit of required reading or homework is Bruce Katz put out a really fantastic piece about opportunity zones recently. I forget the actual title of it, but just Bruce Katz Opportunity Zones, and you'll be able to find it, and we'll give you a really great primer on how to use this program to really flow capital into these types of neighborhoods.
And Deb, could I just, and just, a general observation, as I sit on this side of these panels from time to time, I get the sense from many audiences that you're looking to us to say, here's the manna from heaven, here's the money. Keybanc is not going to come in and lend you or grant you money for your project. There's no pot of money out there that doesn't come either with strings or with time. And I think that the financing plans that you put together should be as independent as possible, and certainly rely on these programs to some extent, but know that these programs do take some time to go through the process with, and they're going to have some requirements that you may or may not be able to live with. And so I think structuring your financing package independently and using these programs as gravy, or certainly to offset your larger program, will be very important, not only in terms of what you're able to do, but also in terms of the time that'll take you to implement it.
So just in wrapping up, one of the things that I think it's worth taking away from this is that there are communities who are going to move forward, and they're going to look at either one of these two approaches for financing a city-wide network to connect everyone over a period of a year or two. Sort of, this is the dream of building out a network, just quickly connecting everyone. I think we're going to see more cities taking this in chunks and thinking, how can I connect this neighborhood today and set myself up to connect another neighborhood tomorrow? I'm going to finance this area over here with this financial mechanism. And for this low income area over here, I'm going to try to find some philanthropy or something for one-time defrayment, because we need to figure out a way of getting them high quality access to, even though they can't afford to pay the kind of rates that would pay it off. But thinking of these things in terms of discrete problems, your communities probably do not have a single broadband problem. You probably have multiple different challenges. Three common ones are simply low income, middle class competition, and business service. And so those could be viewed as three separate different problems depending on how you want to look at it, rather than just thinking our problem is we don't have fiber.
So I will say one more comment, and then we'll thank the group. So what I tell folks is there's no fairy broadband mother. Nobody's dropping in with dollars to solve this problem. And so you got to be creative, think creatively like RS Fiber did, like Ammon, Idaho did. Look at your assets. Don't wait, because as Tom said, there is a cost of doing nothing. And the other thing I would say is reach out and learn from each other, which is really what we're all about, right? Next Century Cities, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, we can connect you with these folks and help you learn from both their mistakes and their successes, right? So what did you do that worked? What did you do that didn't work? What can I learn from your experience? So really networking and spending some time talking to other folks that are working on the same projects you are is always very valuable. And I thank these gentlemen for their time, and they're also very generous with hopping on a call if you have a question. So thank you all very much.
I just wanted to, before we go to the movie, mention we've been talking about creative models and how many allies there are in this room and how people are working together. And I just wanted to mention that at lunchtime, Mackie McCleary, who is the administrator of the Rhode Island PUC, is here with Jonathan Schrag, who works with him. And they're doing some really interesting creative modeling and around having the electric utility work with 5G providers, as I understand it, to help leverage the networks to provide broadband service to unserved and underserved communities. So just another interesting model that's developing, and maybe at our next conference we can have Mackie talk about that. So thank you.
Or we'll get him on a webinar for Next Century Cities, right? So